In this video, I talk mainly about my personal experiences with a variety of international search and rescue teams that flew into the city of Tacloban in the Philippines after Typhoon Yolanda in 2013. Typhoon Yolanda was a Category 5 typhoon that devastated that part of the Philippines, and I just happened to be there, kind of caught in the middle of it during a bike tour of the Philippines. This is the final video of the 6-part series, and I should point out that when I started shooting this video, in my mind it was only going to be one video, one much shorter video. But when I set up the camera back in April, I ended up talking and telling stories for over 8 hours. So I ended up reducing that content to the 6 videos that I've ended up with. And now I'm coming to something that's a bit different. Till now I've been talking about the similarities between the typhoon disaster in the Philippines and the COVID-19 pandemic, the two disasters and what they might have in common. But now I want to talk about something that's different, which is really quite interesting for me. It's a dissimilarity, I guess. And that is to do with the international response to the crisis, because the two are really quite different. And a big part of my experience in Tacloban has to do with the arrival of relief personnel from all around the world. And because I was spending so much time at the fire station and going out with the body collecting teams, I was there when other disaster and emergency teams started to arrive from all over the world. In fact, and this is something I didn't know until quite a bit later. This was like a long time before my bicycle was actually operational again, and the main road was now cleared, so I could even ride my bike all the way from my hotel. I had to walk it through for some of it, but I could essentially ride my bike out to the airport. And I hadn't been out there to the actual airport to see what was going on. So I finally, however many weeks this was into the adventure, I rode my bike out to the airport, and I was astonished because the land around the airport had been transformed into a relief center unlike anything I'd ever seen. Huge teams had flown in from countries all around the world. And this was actually getting towards the end, and a lot of the teams were even packing up and leaving. So it was not even as active as it was for most of this period. So for example, there was a hospital, like a full-on hospital there from Australia. So when the news of this disaster came out and the Philippines put out a call for help, the whole world rallied. And these emergency teams, from Australia, flew in with this complete hospital, everything you could need to run a hospital, the tents, the generators, the sleeping area, the patient treatment areas, all underneath these giant tents. They've got, portable bathrooms, all the medical equipment, on and on and on, doctors and nurses, and they were there to treat the local people. And I really wish I had made it out there earlier, because I spoke to quite a few people there, and they told me stories about what was going on at the height of their activity. Because when I got there, it was pretty calm. Like I said, it was kind of shutting down. But the stories they told me was that it had been a very important place. And they treated so many local people, suffering from all kinds of things that you wouldn't have anticipated. So their work there, really was valuable. And it wasn't just the Australian team. Again, I should have read my journal entry about this, because I remember talking to people from a lot of different countries, but I can't remember them right now. But there were, teams from from India, from Pakistan, from European countries, from Canada, from the United States, from everywhere. And they all had different operations going on out at the airport. And that was really quite fascinating to see. And something I never thought about either, this was all brand new to me. It turns out that a lot of these teams, like the Australians, for example, they were just leaving behind all their equipment. And it was just a logistical and financial decision, because for them to take all of this gear back to Australia, they have to have all the airplanes to carry it. But not only that, when it gets back to Australia, all of it has to be quarantined, put into isolation, sanitized. It has to be treated because it just came out of a disaster zone, and they do not want to transport any toxins or viral infections or anything from this disaster zone into Australia. So all this equipment would have to be treated at a very high level and sanitized. And they crunched the numbers and they realized that it's just not worth it to them. The equipment itself, it would cost more to transport it and treat it than the equipment is worth. So they kind of just leave it behind. And early on in the process, as they explained it to me, some of the Filipino officials, they know about this. I think people who have been in these big disasters before, these big relief efforts, they've seen this happen. A lot of stuff comes flowing in, and if you're not exactly ethical and you're a local person, you can kind of take advantage of this. So a lot of the local officials, long before the tragedy was over, they were looking over all this equipment, wondering, what can I get? We know they're gonna leave it all behind. Man, I could really use that generator, and I could really use that, and it's all kind of being divided up. Who is going to get what? And I'm sure some of it will go into official, like go to the local hospital and to the schools or to the churches or wherever it goes. But there was definitely an element of profiteering going on, with all this gear out at the airport. So you've got this big relief effort of stuff and gear and food and supplies pouring into Tacloban from all around the world. And back at the fire station, the same thing was going on, but in a different way. One day I was at the fire station, and to my delight, a team from Canada showed up. This team was called CASDA. I think it stands for Canadian Search and Disaster Dogs Association. It's like a non-profit, voluntary organization. And what they do is they train dogs for search and rescue. So you're talking about water rescue, wilderness rescue, where there's earthquakes, and all the buildings have collapsed and people are trapped underneath the rubble. Post typhoon search and rescue. And these dogs are trained to sniff out human bodies, whether alive or dead, and then find these people. Ideally, of course, you get there fast after a disaster, like after an earthquake, while people are trapped under the rubble and they're still alive. And CASDA would show up, and with their dogs, they would find where the people are buried, mark the spot, and then, rescue teams would go in, clear the debris, and then rescue these people. In Tacloban, the role was different, of course, because there was really nobody to rescue. There were a lot of bodies out there, but none of them were alive anymore. These were all bodies that were buried under the rubble, and the role of CASDA was to go out with a team of Filipinos, and the dogs would locate the bodies. They would indicate where a body was buried, and then the Filipino teams would mark it with a flag, and then at some point they would go in and then try to remove the debris and then remove the body, that was there. It was quite something to see them at work, you know, to see them when they arrived. I can't even imagine what's involved in, well, I know what's involved in training the dogs and being prepared, but then you've got a disaster all the way in the Philippines. How do you and your dogs, everything you need, everything the dogs need, how do you now get all of that to the disaster zone? So I mean, that is probably half the battle, just getting there. So them, and it was a lot of the cost too. This was something I thought about a lot, just how expensive it was. All the airfares for the humans and the dogs, you know, to fly all the way from Canada to the Philippines. So this was a big investment of money to even get them there, even though they are volunteers. And then you see these Canadians, and I hadn't seen anybody like that for a very long time. These tall people, you know, who look like me, and they're all in their CASDA rescue outfits, and they're there with tents, and they're setting up tents in the public square of Tacloban because that's where they're going to be sleeping. And best of all, of course, they've got these big, furry, friendly dogs with them. And I mean, love dogs. You know, I just cannot get enough of dogs and cats. So just to see these dogs in action, I just wanted to dive on them and then give them belly rubs and scratch them and pet them. I controlled myself, and I didn't do that because, after all, you know, as I know enough that, okay, these are working dogs and they're handlers. They don't need me in their faces, you know, petting the dogs and treating them like pets, right? They're working dogs. They're there to do a job, and they don't need the local tourist who was dumb enough to get caught in a typhoon to be messing around with their dogs and distracting them from their work. So I kept my distance from the dogs, no matter how much I wanted to, you know, pounce on them. But I did go out with the CASDA team a couple of times just to see them at work. And it was quite interesting, yeah, fascinating to watch them at work. These dogs, of course, I think are more suited to cooler temperatures. The Philippines was a pretty hot place for them, and it was such a dangerous place for them as well. I don't think I can emphasize this enough, how dangerous these debris fields were, where, you know, entire houses had all been blown to bits, and you have these giant debris fields. And as a human being, you're walking around, there were so many dangers there, you know, like the nails sticking up. And these dogs, of course, were exposed to all of that danger, while they're climbing over the worst of these debris fields trying to sniff out dead bodies. So it's a pretty intense kind of experience. In the middle of all this relief effort that was going on around me, and even going out with the body retrieval teams, I did feel a little bit like a fifth wheel. There was nothing really for me to do, so I was always sort of just hanging out and taking pictures and, socializing with these people, but I wasn't technically working with them, even though I wanted to. But this is something else I learned about disasters, and that is, for the hero, if you want to be Bruce Willis in an action movie rescuing people and helping them, it's really not that easy to do. Later on as well, other NGOs showed up, and a lot of the teams now were staying in downtown Tacloban. There was one hotel in particular that was kind of the most luxurious of the hotels, the one that was still offering the most services, I think. And a lot of the expats and foreigners that were flying in were congregating there and staying there. So I went there deliberately to help. I wanted to offer my services. I don't know what I could do. I was just as in trouble as a lot of the local people. It's not like I had food that I could hand out to people. I didn't have hammers and nails to give people. I couldn't build a house. I had nothing that I personally could do, but I thought if I could link up with Oxfam or any of the other dozens of NGOs that were now operating, I could, tie in with their logistics and just say, hey, I'm here, I'm from Canada, and I've got time on my hands. Put me to work. What can I do to help? So, oddly enough, I did that. I went up to all these organizations, and they wouldn't let me do anything. Because, real world, bureaucracy, if I go out with the Oxfam team, I'm not covered by their insurance because I'm not part of their organization. So you can only really do work like that if you are part of the organization. You get injured, they have insurance to medevac you out, to treat you, to do all these things. I get injured, they can't help me, and they do not need that hassle. So, unless you're officially part of Oxfam, they can't even accept your help. And something like that had never really occurred to me before. I guess I was kind of used to the more easygoing flow in the Philippines, like going to the fire station and they're going out to collect dead bodies, and I'm kind of being me, kind of like an eager puppy saying, can I come? And the Filipino teams were like, sure, it's a big truck. Come on the truck and let's go, So they're quite a bit more relaxed, but as soon as you're dealing with an international organization from Sweden or from Switzerland or from Canada, you can't do that. You can't just hop on the truck and go with them and start helping people at random. It's just not really how that world works. So I did feel quite a bit like a fifth wheel. So I was pretty happy at one point when I met the CASDA team, and I was still with them at the end of the day, and they were in the park setting up their tents, and they're going to sleep at night in the tents, and they've been out all day, and they're just a wreck, right? They're hot, they're dirty, and they're tired. And, I floated the idea that, well, just around the corner, I actually have a hotel room, no power, nothing like that, but I do have a bathroom with a door that you can close, and I have giant garbage pails full of fresh water, and I have a stove where I can, I can boil water and make tea and coffee or soup. If you want to come back with me in pairs or one at a time, whatever you want to do, come back with me. And if you want to, take a shower, bucket bath shower, change into some fresh clothes, and they took me up on that. So I was happy as can be, leading my little team of CASDA rescue workers back to my hotel room, and they could while one was taking a shower, getting cleaned up, I'd boil water and make instant coffee for them and chat with them. And that was a wonderful, wonderful time. As I was thinking about making this video, I was thinking about the CASDA team, so I went online and I looked up their website. I was curious to see whether they had posted pictures of all their various rescue jobs around the world. Turns out they haven't. Their website is actually quite simple. It looks a little bit like it was made 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and they haven't really made it slick or fancy. So it's quite a simple website, and it doesn't have any pictures from Tacloban, anything like that. But you can go to see their website and get information about CASDA, and of course I'll put a link in the description below. I remember another interesting team I came across was a search and rescue team from South Korea. I didn't spend a lot of time with them. Again, we had kind of a language and cultural barrier, which I did not have with the Canadian team. But I did meet them and chatted with them for a while. And they were a whole different operation because they were a high-tech rescue team, and they operated with drones. And that was amazing to see. So they had these specialized drones with heat sensing and infrared cameras or whatever they had on these things. And they were flying drones around Tacloban, and then they were locating areas that needed help, or locating areas where there were bodies to be collected, or anyone that was in trouble. And that was kind of their role with the drone system that they had. And that was cool. And the last team I'll talk about was a team from the United States. I don't remember the name of them. Maybe I can look it up in my journal and I'll put it down below in a caption. But they were also a search and rescue team, but they had a different approach. They didn't have rescue dogs and they didn't have drones. I guess what they had was good old American know-how. I mean, they showed up, big, strong guys, tough guys, and they had everything you might want to deal with a tragedy, in the way of chainsaws, sawzall, all the heavy-duty gear. I think they had hydraulic jacks, that they could use to lift things, to move debris, chainsaws to cut away wood and then bury into things and rescue people and retrieve bodies. And I spent quite a few days with this American team as well. I hope they didn't mind. I felt a little bit fifth wheelie with them as well. I just really wanted to see them at work. And, I went out with them and took pictures. And I tried to stay out of their way as much as possible. Again, I couldn't really insert myself into the actual activities because, again, that's not how these things work. Insurance and all of that. And on this particular day, it was kind of late or mid-afternoon, they got a report of a body that needed to be recovered. And it was in the coastal area where all the ships had been lifted up and dropped on land. And an elderly woman's body was trapped right underneath one of these ships. So we're talking about tens of thousands of tons of steel on top of this woman that was trapped underneath this ship. And you really could not get a more dramatic situation than that. So the American team got all their gear together, and they had trucks, of course, to go to these places. And interestingly enough, it was an area that I had already been to many times. So this area that they went to, where these ships were, and the whole destroyed section of houses there, I had already been there quite a few times, so I knew exactly where we were going. So we get there, and the Americans pile out of their trucks, and then we have to walk down this long access area, this road, through all the debris fields and piles until we finally got to this ship. And the local people were waiting, and they pointed out, where this body was. And then these Americans had to get to work digging through all the debris, like digging a tunnel through the debris and then putting in place these big hydraulic jacks to kind of, hold the ship in position so it doesn't come even further down. This work went on for a long time, and people from the area gathered around to watch, more and more people. And I would leave from time to time with my camera and go walking and go exploring and talk to other local people and get their stories. And then I'd come back to check on their progress. And then quite late in the day, just as the sun was going down, basically, I finally managed to clear enough debris away that they could pull the body out. The body was placed inside a body bag. And then we found out that some of the people that were there watching were family members. One woman there was the daughter. So the body that we had recovered was of her mother. And we were talking to her. And in the real world, like out in the real world, and in normal times, I guess, this is your mother. And there's a system in place now to move forward. In Canada, of course, the body would be transported to a hospital, to a mortuary, to a funeral home, and then, arrangements are made for a funeral and all that kind of formal activity. But in the middle of this disaster, on the scale of it, with so many bodies, and with really no institutions operational, that sort of thing doesn't happen. So it was kind of an awkward moment about what happens now. I remember feeling that quite strongly as I was standing there. You got these big burly Americans with all their tools, and they just, done their job and done it well, got the body out, and then there's the daughter, this was her mother, and then what happens next? And really the only thing that could happen is what we did. People picked up the body bag, and all of us in a group, we walked away from the ship and made our way back to the main street, the main road down which we had arrived by truck. And when we got there, there were piles of debris and piles of garbage on the street. People had slowly been pushing things to the side of the road to clear the way for cars and motorcycles. And these giant piles of garbage and debris were building up everywhere. And then right in the middle of all this, all that they really could do was take the body of this mother and place her in amongst these piles at the side of the road. Because that was the system, that's how things worked. And then this location would be noted and sent back to the fire department. And at some point, one of the trucks driving around would come here and collect that body. So, we put the body down there at the side of the street. And then there was really not much else to be done. The Americans and myself, we got back in the trucks and we drove back to the fire station. And the woman that we'd been talking to, the daughter, we had to leave her there, and she had no choice but to stay there with the body of her mother at the side of the road. And then eventually, I assume as night fell, she would have to make her way back to the rest of her family, whatever shelter that they were staying in, and just had to leave her mother, at the side of the road for later pickup. That's just how extreme, it was at that time. The point I was working towards, though, is how different this was from the situation now in the COVID-19 era. Because all of these stories I've just told are about people, emergency response teams, hospital teams, doctors, nurses, personnel, all flying into Tacloban, getting in there, getting stuck in, getting dirty with the local people and helping as much as they can. And I think that's the normal reaction to a disaster that we're all used to. If you've been alive long enough, you've seen your share of disasters around the world. It hits the news. Disaster, big earthquake, collapse, next part of the story, emergency teams flying in, relief teams from all around the world, different governments organizing relief efforts, and all these people and equipment flies in to help. COVID-19, total opposite, isn't it? And I find that kind of fascinating because all of the ways to combat the virus, to combat the pandemic, mean you don't go anywhere. Travel is banned. Social interaction is banned. And that is so different from what happened in Tacloban, where even if there are people all around the world that could use a lot of help, they're kind of on their own because there are no emergency teams flying in. I've seen some stories online about supplies being loaded onto jets in different places, masks or medical equipment, and being flown to other countries where they're in short supply. I have seen those articles. There are probably financial donations going around the world from richer countries to poorer countries, but you're not going to have the same level of hands-on international relief efforts. You're not going to have the UN showing up, building refugee camps, all that kind of stuff. With Tacloban, interestingly enough, and I did not learn about this story until probably not even months later. I don't think I knew this story until years later, because back in those days, I was barely aware of YouTube, YouTubers, and certainly I had never heard of the godfather of vlogging, Casey Neistat. I'd never heard the name before, had no idea who the guy was. It was not on my radar in any way. And Casey Neistat was actually involved in the relief effort for Tacloban. He made a whole big video about it. And again, I didn't see the video until many, many years later. But he had a project, I forget the exact details. He either took $25,000 of his own money or $25,000 of donations, I'm not sure. But in any event, his video was all about flying to the Philippines with $25,000. What can we do with that much money? What can we buy? And what can we bring to Tacloban to help the local people? So the video is about him showing up in the Philippines and arranging transportation, going to stores, buying up as much stuff as he can, and then transporting it to Tacloban, and then trying to distribute all this relief effort. So there's a very good example of a very personal, hands-on approach to a disaster. And now in the COVID-19 pandemic, however much Casey Neistat wants to do something like that, it's not going to happen, because you physically cannot go to an airport, fly to a country, and then start handing out, supplies and helping people. It's the exact opposite, where instead of countries opening up, we've got countries shutting down and closing. Borders are closed, airports are closed. You can't fly in, can't fly out. You got to go into quarantine. Even if you did go to a new country, 14 days in quarantine, and then you couldn't even travel within that country to get anywhere where you might want to help people. And that's such a fascinating difference between this situation and what I think of as a normal disaster. Like every other disaster I've ever heard about in my life, this one is completely different from that, because the battle against it is basically non-social. We stop being social, and we cannot go anywhere to help anybody out. And that's a very interesting difference between the two disasters. The ending of my time in Tacloban after Typhoon Yolanda, Typhoon Haiyan, was really kind of a simple one. A lot of time had passed. I probably would have even stayed longer, because the city was still pretty much devastated. Some rebuilding had begun, and I think I would have enjoyed staying around to watch the rest of it. I'll never forget the sound of the hammers. It was quite something, because all those shoreline communities that had been wiped out, almost instantly they started rebuilding, like I said. And then in all my days of walking around that area, all you heard was the pounding of hammers. Hundreds of hammers, just hammering, 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 hammering. It was like a background noise of Tacloban that followed me around everywhere that I went. And it would have been quite interesting to see it through all the way to the end, to when power returned, to when things really did go back to normal. How did they put those ships back in the ocean? Stuff like that. I'm still very curious about that. But, there was the real world to think about. And to be honest, the only reason I left Tacloban was because my visa was expiring, and I had to make sure to get to Cebu. The weird thing is, I tried to go to the immigration office in Tacloban. That's why I was there to begin with. That's how this whole thing happened. They had an immigration office there where I could extend my visa. And I was hoping the whole time that before my 2 months was up, they would reopen. And I kept returning to the immigration office site, where their offices, where they're located. It was on a hill right down by the water. And I went there over and over again, and there were people there, and I kept asking, now, like, when will you be operational? But no, it didn't happen. So there was no immigration service there within the 60 days. So eventually I had no choice but to leave and make my way to Cebu. I got on my bicycle, had all my gear back on my bike. My bike was in pretty rough shape, but you know, I could limp along. And I told the story about my very first night when I got to a hotel that had electricity and running water. And my mind was absolutely blown. You know, I was just jumping around like a crazy person. So excited to see an electric light again. Anyway, I was so excited to get that electricity in my first hotel room, running water. I was so excited. And then from there, I eventually made my way to a coast, and I could get on a boat with my bicycle that took me to Cebu, found a hotel there, and then I made it to an immigration office in Cebu before my visa expired, and then I got another 60-day extension, and my life went on. And I spent a lot of days at the internet cafe in Cebu, again, because I didn't have my own computer or smartphone or anything. So all of the looking for information on Google about what had just happened in Tacloban, that was all taking place in a internet cafe surrounded by dozens of young Filipino boys screaming and yelling and playing all their video games. That's basically what internet cafes were used for at that time. So there I was with all the video game playing boys and reading about everything that happened in Tacloban and seeing my experience from the outside world's perspective. And that's kind of where all this food for thought started building, about that experience, what it looked like from so many different perspectives, and how it compares to this disaster today, you know, with COVID-19. So yeah, so much food for thought. Those are my thoughts about the typhoon in Tacloban in the Philippines. Happened in 2013, comparing it to the pandemic of 2020. As I said, a lot of food for thought. If you want to see video of what happened in Tacloban, all the stuff I've been talking about, I mean, it's so easy to do. Just go on YouTube or Google, but you know, go to YouTube, type in Typhoon Yolanda, Typhoon Haiyan, and you will get hundreds of videos from all different points of view of what happened there, news stories. But yeah, those are all my thoughts. Thanks for hanging out and listening to me. I have all these stories from Tacloban in my head. I'm sure you think I've told a lot of stories, maybe too many stories, but trust me, I barely scratched the surface. So many other things went on there. I have quite a few other stories to tell, but I think those stories are enough to flesh out the theme I was trying to develop here. So this video is coming to an end. As I said, thanks for hanging out with me and listening to my stories. Hope you enjoyed some of that. And from Neistat, Thailand in 2020, April of 2020, I'll see you in the next video.